Okay, so a drop-in, like I mentioned before, is just an invitation for you to go inward, like into your body. So unlike prayer, which is outward, or worship, which is outward, dropping in is going into your body. So for those of you who are doing this for the first time, you can just follow my guidance, my voice, to give you the prompts on what to do next. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to close our eyes. Okay, so much like in prayer, right? Closing your eyes allows you to just be susceptible to your other sensations. So close your eyes and feel how it feels to be inside of your inner world, your body. When we close our eyes, we can listen to how we feel inside of ourselves. You may be coming from the end of your day, so bring yourself into a position that is comfortable, letting the palms face upwards. You can do that if that feels rightful. Allow yourself to have full permission to shift out of doing and into being. Begin to notice the rhythm of your own breath as it flows in and out of the body. What is the temperature of your inhale? And what is the temperature and feeling of your exhale? So just notice the sensations of your inhale and notice the sensations of your exhale. And if ever you feel like letting yourself create like an audible sigh when you exhale, that's fine. You're just releasing your breath, feeling what it feels like to be you as the breath exits the body. So just allow yourself to become more senseful of your own body through the receiving of the inhale and the releasing through the exhale. Now notice your facial muscles, the brow, the corners of your eyes, the jaw. Notice how when you breathe in and breathe out, those begin to relax. And if you've never noticed that before, just allow yourself to feel the softening and the melting down of your face, the brow, the eyes, the jaw. Moving down through to your shoulders. Allow this meltiness to trickle down through to your arms. If you've been carrying responsibilities or burdens, let your shoulders completely release and your upper back completely release, softening towards the ground. If there are places of stuckness that you're unable to relax, that's perfectly fine. You can just simply bring loving kindness, warmth to those parts of your body. Start to go down into the belly region, feeling and letting each breath soften the belly. Breathing into the breath and depth that's there. Slowly begin to feel the muscles and the organs in the belly, allowing your breath to gently swirl and open. And if it feels good, you can gently massage the belly, letting it be at ease. Feeling this breath flowing in and out of the belly. Start to bring it deeper into your hips. Feeling your seat relax and softening through the hips, the fleshiness of the thighs. Allowing yourself to just feel that region of your lower body. If it's right for you, you can place one hand over your chest and one hand on your belly, feeling the body breathe, feeling the warmth of your own hands, sensing into the lower body, belly, becoming aware of your pelvic basin. And this is the space where you can soften and allow a sense of opening, a gentle sense of surrender, the meltiness of vulnerability. Just sense the legs, the relaxing of the thighs, the softening of your knees. Feeling the sensations of your own lower body. This is the region of the body for women that is the wellspring of our female and our feminine essence. So what is here is to be discovered when we slow down and listen and practice opening to receive. And it's from this space that I invite you to climb in and to join me in this exploration, in this excavating of the deeper teachings inside of Queen Esther, her lived school of obedience and submission to the masculine. So you can just remain in the posture that you are in as I begin the transmission. feel free to move your body, open your eyes, keep them closed. If you're one of those people who, like me, it is rightful for you to like receive things audio-wise, then you can remain hidden and in that receptive type of darkness. That is perfectly okay. All right, so Queen Esther. I am coming into this transmission from two particular vantage points. The first is the lineage that I practice, which for many of you will be the lineage of Christ, Jesus Christ. And because of this lineage, we have tended to, not always rightfully, not always in right relationship, but we have tended to co-opt biblical figures for our entitlement. And I can understand that because of the history of this lineage. And I acknowledge that with the history of this lineage comes imperfection, distortion, even if as Christians, which means follower of the way of Christ, we have tried to utilize the Bible and its teachings to bring forth or put forward what our people have felt is the truth. So that's one. The second path that I am coming from is a path that, compared to this more Abrahamic, like patriarchal model of religion, of religious practice, is kind of, I'm going to use the word vilified or even villainized, which might sound like me speaking some feminist lingo, but I am not, because we live in a reality of duality. There is a masculine and a feminine aspect to everything in this universe. There is a dark and a light. There is a night and a day. There is a male and a female aspect in this three-dimensional topside world that we have. And for lack of better words, there are masculine and feminine energetics and principles in the metaphysical that we try to describe with our words. So when I speak of Queen Esther, who is deemed a historical figure, and even that, right, is also still under a lot of controversy, whether she was a real person or she was archetypal, right? The important thing here, or maybe that's not the right word, the key here is not to latch on who is correct or who is right, who is, like who holds the most proof about this person, which religion is teaching it properly, et cetera, et cetera. The invitation here with these 2 points of convergence is, I don't know. And blindness and not knowing is actually one of the most healing postures, embodiments, and representations and felt sense of the feminine. So my intention here is not to be a biblical scholar. It's not to prove to you that Queen Esther was real or that she was, some mythical figure, but to immerse yourself in the story of this woman and the realities of the context of this story, which are historical, if in fact they are proven to be true. But again, to not get caught up in the headiness of Queen Esther, and to instead, like we did in the practice earlier, invite yourself into the felt sense of who she is. Because her obedience and her submission are powerful teachers for our physical relationship with our husbands, with our suitors, with our relationship with God, who in the language that I use in my spaces is the highest masculine person and principle, the Father. So who was Esther? Okay, so for those of you who, like me, you read your Bible throughout the years, I've been reading my Bible since I was 9 years old. Okay, Queen Esther is typified as a heroine of the Jewish nation. So she was raised in captivity during the time of the diaspora, or when the nation of Israel had been dispersed and Persia was the dominant empire of the time. And at this time, the Hebrews, the Jews, were in captivity in Persia. Okay, so this woman who was around, in fact, 40 years old at the time of this event that we are going to feel into and have a felt sense around. So she was around maybe 35, 36 years old. Old in terms of the contextually what was suitable as a virgin bride of the time. Okay, so this woman was actually the replacement queen of King Xerxes. So King Xerxes was a Persian emperor king, meaning he ruled far and wide over the empire. And between the time of either divorcing or executing his primary wife, which was his queen, Vashti, for refusing to exhibit herself, he, after 4 years in battle, battle scarred, was just looking to enjoy like what powerful men have always enjoyed, which is power, status, and sensual adventures. So he was really looking for a new consort, right? You had consorts, you had concubines, and you had queens if you were a powerful man who held imperial power at the time. And so he was looking for his number one woman, essentially. In the harem, the queen would be his wife and distinguished from other concubines and consorts of the king. So this is what Esther was groomed to be. She was groomed to be a beautiful addition to his harem, but for a specific position of queen or preferred consort in many ways, right? Because the queen at this time held esteem amongst the different wives and categories of wife and consort and concubine, right? So when Esther was presented to the king, she first underwent beauty treatments for 6 months. For those of you familiar with the scriptures, it's one of our favorites because, we tend to codify it with like self-care and all of these, modern stipulations. But if you go into how virgins were prepared for the king, they were prepared ritualistically. So there was nothing like, if you were to go into like the deeper layers of her preparation, there was something both beautiful about how she was cleansed and how she was prepared and how she was beautified. I mean, she was already physically beautiful, even at 35, 36 years old, right? Otherwise, she wouldn't have even met the standards for that time. But her age, I find interesting because typically, and you can read like books and literature about this time, but typically you would choose a woman who was much younger if you wanted to have babies, because at this time, kings and noble men, they spread their seed as far and as wide to ensure their lineage, their bloodline. So it's interesting that Esther was an older woman because perhaps, and again, this is again not a teaching, but just a felt sense, her maturity and her beingness as a older woman, quote unquote, yet still beautiful, was seen by the king. Like the text says, he was enamored of her. He fell in love with her. Now, typically at these times, this type of language was not used for powerful imperial men who were treated as gods. Hence, Esther being cleansed and bathed in oils of myrrh for 6 months, right? But her age, if indeed she was, like we don't know enough about Queen Esther, she's still a mystery school in and of herself. If she was this age, then at the time, she is actually considered an older woman, not concubine-ish, which, concubines, their function was really to birth the progeny and create more heirs because they were younger. They were more, in terms of biology, they were more in their fertility window. Older women were more established in other realms of wisdom, of knowledge, of gnosis. Yeah. We also don't know if this king was younger or older because he could have been either one. But I want you to feel into this interesting and probably less often spoken about quality of this queen, right? She was not like other women that the king would have typically selected for his harem. And often as women, towards our relationship with the masculine, our relationship with men, our relationship with our spouses, how many times have we felt standardized against societal, biological constructs, and then self-devaluated? Oh, I'm old. That's why my husband is looking at younger women. I'm old, and that's why I don't feel as fecund and flourishing, and like I have less possibilities according to this red pill content creator or this book or this this, that, or the other. But Queen Esther was 35, 36 years old when she became the beloved of the most powerful man at the time in the empire. So one of my first invitations for all of you, especially in this space of feminine exploration or, femininity school, which sometimes it can feel like on Instagram, like you look at different teachers, what they're teaching, what they're saying. You have ever felt that you were unseen, insignificant, too old, too like this, too like that. Just feel into this aspect of Esther, because she also, in terms of societal and cultural standards, was an old woman. But yet she was set apart for a specific function, as we will find out later on in her story. So before we go into the next pillar, which is actually going to be a very dark time for Esther, I invite you to, again, drop into your system internally. Again, sensing the breath of life coursing through your body, through your inhale and your exhale. And I want you to notice the textures and sensations of your body, your physical body. Much like this maiden in captivity, Esther, who was raised inside of captivity, not knowing, not expecting, not even, at least based on what we know, not even planning what her future could be. 35, 36 years old in ancient Persia, a prisoner, yet roaming in a foreign empire, growing up not even with her own father, but with an adoptive uncle, who by all measures at the time was a rightful father, honorific father. Have you ever felt as you, in the same way Esther must have felt, not knowing, not planning, not expecting the greatness of her missional calling and what would be her vocation? Have you ever felt limited or living inside of a experience of a dead end, an ageism of your own body, a vilification of where you are right now? because the invitation for you is that God is not done with you yet. God is never done with us. When we are feminine beings that are being purified and rarefied, just like Esther was purified, rarefied, bathed in preparation. How am I, how are you being bathed and purified and rarefied through your own lived experience? What is the myrrh? Myrrh has always historically been defined as a bitter herb, and yet the most beautiful fragrance. What is the myrrh of my life right now? What is the paradoxical alchemy of my current situation? What is the bitterness and the beautiful fragrance of my current posture and devotion to God? Okay. Pillar 2, dung and ashes. Now, in the story of Esther, which continues after she was crowned queen, there was a political turmoil happening. Basically, one of the king's advisors, his name was Haman, was plotting a revolt and a usurpation of power. And his objective was to plant a conflict in the king using the queen, using Queen Esther. But before all of this, like before this kind of role of Esther, the man who raised Esther, his name was Mordecai. Okay. Mordecai had gotten wind that Haman planned to usurp the king by killing the Jews, his people, right? Because, the Jews are going to overtake us. There's too many of them in the diaspora, so we must kill them all. Now, Esther was a Jew, meaning that if Haman and his decree would have played out, Esther would be included in the annihilation of the Jewish people. And so this put Esther in a very unique position because she was already inside of the harem, the palace, basically the territory of the king. And she happened to not just be a queen, but she was a queen who had evoked the love of the king. Very different in her age and in her like the type of woman that she was, right? So when Mordecai realized this, right? Mordecai realized that our people are going to be put to death. You, just because you're his wife, are no exception. They will basically, in modern language, they will also hunt you down and kill you, right? So this is really important to like grasp, because a lot of people make it mean sometimes that Esther was used, that she was, like put there as a manipulative tool. And this is more of like, these modern takes on her. But actually, Esther was properly postured to intervene, not using her beauty, obviously she was beautiful and she had your, in our language here, she had your high value woman traits in her favor. But ultimately, Esther being inside of the king's court was, number one, against her own religion, by the way, because this king that she married was a pagan, at least in the reference point of the Jews, right? So her being placed inside of his harem, selected as his queen, was it was tactical of Mordecai, her uncle. It was, again, without her or his knowing, going to be very significant. And in the text, it specifically says that Mordecai commanded Esther, and Esther obeyed Mordecai, meaning, okay, I can absolutely refuse to be included among the virgins that are gathered for the king. But she was, it says in the text, she obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him, implying that she was an older woman. She could have refused, and yet she said, okay, I will go and be vetted and become this king's wife. Now, when Haman, again, this advisor of the king and official, when he went on his rampage to destroy all of the Jews, right? Haman said to the king, you're going to have to do something about these people. If it please the king, I'm going to destroy them. And so the king actually approved of this, because he didn't know that his own wife was actually included as part of this royal decree to destroy and annihilate the Jews, including women and children. And this is when Mordecai went before the queen, right, in his mourning garb. So for Jews who were going into ritual mourning, they would dress in sackcloth and cover themselves in dung and ashes. And this was really representing the lamentation and the sorrow of their impending doom, but also like representing their perceived posture in front of God. So Esther, of course, was highly distressed herself at this news. And she tried to do what she could, meeting with her assistants and her trusted advisors in the royal household. And she had to navigate politically, even if she was scared for her life, right? How to posture the king, like turn his neck. And this is a very biological teaching, like the woman is the neck, the man is the head. But what she did essentially was she went to the king and said, there is a ploy on your life. And the one who discovered this, Mordecai, she created a story, has not been honored in the royal court for exposing the the plot against you. So the king decides to say, okay, what can we do to honor this man who usurped this plot against me? And the king went through this whole asking of Esther what may be done. And Esther said, and Esther, started to set up this ploy to eventually lead the villain in the story, Haman, to his death. All she did was actually just position herself inside of a experience where she could be in a trusted and intimate conversation or encounter with the king. Now, remember, at this time, because the king was seen as a god, you couldn't just have an audience with the king. You couldn't just be in his presence. You had to be summoned. And so Esther, knowing that if she was going to save her people and she had to beseech the king, she was going to have to risk her life. And again, just like her uncle had clothed and garmented himself in dung and ashes, Esther had to do the same too before her audience with the king. And herein lies another powerful creational code of Queen Esther. Because, if Haman had gone through with his decree and hadn't been exposed as endangering the queen's life, right? And this entire plot hadn't been brought to the light by the queen, one, she would have died anyway because she would have been hunted down. And secondly, she also was risking her life by initiating an audience with the king, aka the god, considered a god at that time. So what she did was, okay, have the Jews telling her uncle, fast for me, not eat or drink for 3 days while I prepare to go to the king, even if it's against the law for me to stand in his presence. And this was her husband. But you have to remember, at the time, husband and wife relationships, marriages, were not as we have them now. They were very ritualistic and they were very much codified. There was a code of behavior And she had not seen the king for about a month. Typically, at the time when you see the king, you sleep with him. And then if you don't get your courses, if you don't get your menses, right, that means you're pregnant. Or if you do, you can go and see him again. But she was not expecting to be summoned by him anytime soon, and the time was ticking for her people. So she was taking a risk. And she covered herself in dungs and ashes, as was the ritual of her people. And she did this in secret. She did this in secret because if anybody but her loyal handmaidens knew what she was doing, she would be revealed, and she would be revealed by Haman, who was an official in the king's household, and be killed. Also likely be killed because she did not reveal that she was a Jew when she was vetted as a potential queen. So like withholding of identity. But she and her uncle did this anyway. So the uncle sent a message throughout the empire to all Jews to fast and pray for the queen. Now, I want you to invite yourself into how Esther must have felt when she was put between, well, she was really in a rock and a hard place in our language. But when have you ever felt in a similar situation where you were fearing an aspect of an encounter with the masculine? And again, I'm not speaking into the dynamics of unhealthy relationships. I'm speaking into dynamics of a right relationship with the masculine, whether it is with God, with your man, your husband, your spouse. When have you ever been inside of that experience of dung and ashes prior to making your audience with him? And this is another archetypal teaching within the story of Esther. Because she was afraid for her life. She was more afraid, you could say, for the annihilation of her people, the Jews. It was a fear of death, not just her own death, but the death of her entire lineage. And how many times have we ever been on the precipice of asking God or our man for a need that only he can provide? How many times have we felt or lived an experience of, this is too much for me to ask. This is too much for me to bring as a need. Whether that be a literal man that we are asking a need from, or it is God. The dung and the ashes that were used by the Jews ritualistically represented humility, humbleness before God. They represented, I don't know what I'm going to do. They represented the felt sense of dust you were, and to dust you shall return. They were representative of death. And how many times have we as women, devotional women, been required to die, metaphorically, to relinquish our egoic preferences for the meeting of our deepest desires. The deepest desire of Esther, if we can just take a moment to root into this practice of her mourning, her deepest desire was not just for her people to be spared. That's the deep desire of the physical Queen Esther that was in a political position to serve her people. But her deep desire was for the king to turn his head towards her. And so, many times, before we receive our truest, deepest desires, can we meet ourselves in the dung and the ashes, in the relinquishing of our preferences in favor of orienting the masculine, God, our husband, our man, barring anything immoral, illegal, or unethical, orienting him to be right. Robed and prepared for the king. This is the third aspect of the school of Esther. So she was still in obedience to the will of God, to stand in between this decree, her people, and the king. So after the days of mourning and sackcloth and vigil, Esther put back her queenly garments and she prepared herself for this life or death situation of the audience with the king. And we want to take a moment here to understand what was going on in like the heart of Esther. Because what she was actually doing here, you would have probably thought, oh, she's just asking him to dinner. But what she was doing was really another ritual, whether she knows it or not. But she is actually practicing a very like metaphysical like ritual by inviting her husband, the king, but he is still the king, right? First and foremost, godlike to the people in his realms. She invited the king and Haman to a dinner. And the king, of course, loving her and like finding favor, Esther finding favor with him, was granted this request of a dinner with Haman and the king. And it was during this encounter that we see one of the most like romanticized like imageries of Esther, because it says that the king's eyes burned with anger at first, seeing Esther unsummoned by the king. Some versions say that she almost fainted. Some versions of the text, I mean. But that the king's appearance softened. Now, this is a beautiful, again, another beautiful teaching on the frequency of feminine, specifically feminine and female gnosis. A little bit about Esther, like if you go to her Hebraic name, her Jewish name, it is Hadassah. And Hadassah was the word at the time for the myrtle tree. And the myrtle tree was, the name Hadassah, myrtle tree, was bestowed on, it was a girl's name for Hebrew girls, but it was bestowed on girls for their meekness, meek girls, girls that were pleasant, right? So it carried with it like these very specific tones and frequency. The name Esther was her Persian name, her name in captivity, right? And so Esther's meekness, this quality about her, some might say that it was a moment of weakness, right? That she was overwhelmed by the king's greatness. And I feel a lot of us do not understand like the deep, deep teaching of Esther's like fainting and overwhelm in the presence of the king. It was a very real fear, right? Because Esther, in spite of, her understanding that she was on a mission for and with God, was still a woman in these biblical times where women were practically seen as property. So she was approaching this man, the most powerful man in the empire, her husband, with all of these fears. And at the time, like you couldn't just approach the king. You had to be summoned by him, or you could die, because the king was considered a deity, a god, holy and sacred, which is why, if you remember, Esther was ritually prepared for 6 months before meeting him. So when she had prepared herself for this life or death situation, her first, and I feel that this really was God filling Esther up first, rather than her reflexively just responding to the intimidating stature of her own husband, the king, although, that is also included. But it was her willingness to risk her own death for the sake of her people that actually softened the heart of the king, but he would never know that until much later on. So I invite you to this particular frequency of Esther because it is a tone and felt sense that has been villainized, most especially by women. And it is the frequency of her submission, her fainting. I feel, and again, this is just my particular threading of this experience for the purpose of our feminine mastery here, our feminine practice here. I feel that her overwhelm and the physical descent of her body, her fainting in the presence of the king, also included the weight of her submission to divine will and divine law. You have to remember that at the time, people viewed God very differently than 21st century believers, religious people believe what they believe about God now. So if you can place yourself in the embodiment of Esther at that moment, royal as she was, beautiful as she was, wise as she was, the will of God and the intimidating presence of the king, the humanness of the king brought her to her knees. And this has been romanticized and imaged in many a movie. I think the most recent one was One Night with the King. Came out about 10 years ago. But I want you to feel into this final pillar of the obedience and submission school of Esther. When in your own embodiment as a woman, your own lived experience, again, barring anything that is illegal, immoral, or unethical, when were you overtaken or just overwhelmed by the sensation of obedience and submission to divine will? Or when were you overtaken, bodily sensation, by the presence of a masculine man, which by all standards of the time, this king was. Often in the practice of the feminine, and this includes your biological femininity, meaning your capacity for being a mother, being a wife, and the feminine, like the primordial feminine, being confronted with the masculine, with his will, with his penetrative gaze, which is what the king gave Esther at first before she collapsed in the overwhelm and sensation of the moment. When have we ever tried to self-protect, hold back from being fully seen, many times for our weakness and our vulnerability? When have we received dogmatic teachings of what it means to be a feminine woman versus being in the feminine, in our organic expression and reciprocity of masculine strength and potency, and even intimidation. Can you feel into the state of Esther, having been shouldered with this missional task of saving her people from her uncle who raised her, who she was and had always been in obedience to, and the weight and the visceral fear of going against what was written law at the time in order to access the favor of her husband. In our feminine practice towards men, towards the masculine in life itself, toward God, where have we unconsciously armored rather than how Esther received this, rather than faintly falling and showing exquisite vulnerability? When have we encountered the king in our man, and it has confronted us and rightfully initiated in us a response of overwhelm and, at the same time, feminine descent and humility, rightful humility? Sometimes the king, the metaphorical aspect of king in our lives, is something that God wants us to do or would like us to present to him. Sometimes the king in our lives is a literal man in the rightness of his masculinity, not in the egoic, immature, and disembodied masculine. Sometimes the king is that juxtaposition of, I have so much respect for this man, and yet I am aware of my own vulnerability and the weight of sensation of bringing my request to him. Many times we are in that very posture of submission. Submission is not what we do to the king or to the man or to God. It is evoked in us because of our profound respect for the king and our man, that we, again, in like earlier in this transmission, we want to make him right, albeit the immoral, illegal, and unethical. Those are the only conditions for not submitting. Matters of sin, right? We could say. But in those times where, yes, where we have turned away to feign strength and impermeability and like, I'm not going to show my tears with you. Where have we failed to embody the rightness of being the neck, like to the head being the king, the head being the one who directs the relationship. And this refers to God, and this refers to imperfect human beings. So how does Esther's story end, and how can we bring with us this practice of like willing submission, rightful orienting of the king to be right, to lead, and to direct? Because if you really like take the time to deepen into the story of Esther, and you've been around my work for a while, and we always talk about like the female defining the conditions of the relationship, the feminine setting the tone, her entire experience has really been the setter of the tone of the felt sense of the king, which is why in the very final chapter of her story, well, specifically the one 3/4 through her story, she is able to go to the king and specifically ask for her life and the life of her people. And the king says something beautiful: Queen Esther, whatever your desire is, it will be given to you, even half of my kingdom. What does that say about how this woman is able to, through no doing of her own, like no forcing of herself, she is able to alchemize respect for the king, obedience to God, and submission to divine will and to divine law. She is able to not just gain the approval of the king, but to the point where in a eternal, in like an ancient document like the Bible, those very words are recorded. Notice she uses the words specifically: if it pleases you, if I am in favor with you, if you think it's the right thing to do, if you are pleased with me. These are strewn across all of her verbiage. Ultimately, this was a woman who understood how to posture herself towards the masculine and to orient him to be right. Because what's our deepest desire, ladies? It's not that our man will do everything for us, hook, line, and sinker. It's that no matter what he does, unless it is unethical, immoral, or illegal, or endangering the life of you and the children, it is right. Make him right versus making him wrong, making God wrong. God, why did you allow this in my life? I was speaking inside of Feminine and Free the other day and kind of laying it out for some of the ladies there that God is not the cause of an evil that has happened to you. People and the sin in this world, the fracture in this dualistic world that we live in, the fracture between our humanity and the divine is what breeds the environment for evil or the bad things that happen to me. But it is never God. Just like technically it is never God also that brings you your blessings. And again, I'm saying that in air quotes because of course God is good and God is, but God is not a genie that just delivers the prayers that we render. Note, Esther, if it pleases you, if I am regarded with your favor, if you think it is right, if you are pleased, if you. And again, this is not limited to women when we are talking about God. When we are talking about God, the collective humanity is the feminine aspect relating to the Father, the King, the Lord, the masculine aspect. So when we are orienting towards God, we actually want God to be right. Okay, God, my suitor isn't here yet. The man who is my husband, I want to get married so badly, and he's not here yet. If it pleases you, and if I am in your favor, and you think that it is the right time for me to have a suitor now, that is all I want. You see the difference? Orienting God to be right is of service to us, because then we are no longer in this flailing, flinging, chaotic aspect of just trying to control everything. Oh, like my husband isn't this, he's not doing that, he's not, why can't he be more like these masculinity people that I see on Instagram during my unconscious scrolling and unwielded consciousness? Right? We do that. We do that too. Instead of, if it pleases you, King, if I am in favor with you, and we always are. I think we forget that when it comes to God, we are always in his favor. We may not see it that way because of our dualistic way of thinking in this three-dimensional world where polarity and dualistic nature exists and time exists. But suspend time, we are always in God's favor. But as Jesus wisely said, everything is always in his time. And such was the positioning of Esther. She followed and submitted to the right place and the right time for the king. For the king. It was always in her movement and in the way she practiced submission and obedience. It was always to orient him to be right. Now, please don't take this to mean just a three-dimensional aspect of this practice. When I say that we are orienting the masculine to be right, it also includes principles of the masculine. Not just men, because we can only bestow and show respect and trust in a man if it is true, not if it is untrue. So like Haman faking the like pontificates and the displays of honor were wrong, right? We cannot also splay open and display and grant our respect, our obedience, and our submission to any man if it is not true. Because women who do that are not orienting him to be right. And this is the entrapment of codependency and anxious attachment to a relationship, insecure attachment to unhealthy patterns, and even provisions. I have had to correct, and I use that word specifically, correct women, wives, actually, from living inside of experiences where trust and respect and obedience was not in her rightful orienting to a man. And these are the cases when the man was doing something immoral, illegal, or unethical. So barring that, because a true expression of the masculine is only tantamount to a woman in the true expression of the feminine. That is it. That's the law of reciprocity, the law of polarity that operates in this universe that God created. And so, Esther, what we can learn from this beautiful heroine is, and I want to invite you to bring home with you this beautiful tone. It is a tone that rings throughout space and time and beyond this story. If it pleases the king. If it pleases the king.
I believe it's mentioned around 7 times inside of that entire 10 chapters of the book of Esther. And this is not a school of obedience and submission reserved only for people who read the Bible. The beauty of this story, because it's not even a Christian story, right? It's not. It's a Jewish story. And even that is not like a point of importance. The point is that this woman carried feminine creational codes that ring throughout space and time and provide us with the wisdom and the posture, the devotional posture, which is our power as women in orienting the king, whoever the king is for you, God, your man, orienting him to be right. Not bypassing his faults and not bypassing unconscious and unmetabolized, immature masculine behavior. Because if you're a woman, you define the conditions of associating with males. Never forget that. That is divine creational law beyond dogmatic teachings, which all come home to, again, that creational code, that creational tone of Esther, said in words, if it pleases the king. I imagine she also would pray in her sackcloth and ashes, if it pleases the Lord. And at that time, the Jews specifically called him Yahweh. But if it pleases you, that is the most beautiful and deep and multifaceted provision of the school of Esther. And so let us descend into that frequency one last time. And then let's have time for a few questions or reflections and shares. So I invite you once more to drop in within, to be inside of your body, to orient yourself towards the masculine in life itself, God, and just feel in your body the sensefulness and the sensation of being in the presence of God. And now God has been so codified and formalized and prescriptive for many of us, but God is the realness of your own body. That is also God. That is the life of the spirit inside of you. God is also the dome and the territory over and around you at the same time. And your prayer are not just the words that you say outward to God, but your embodied felt sense of Him who is. And so I invite you to just feel the sensation first within your own body of the infilling, of aliveness, of your own breath coursing through and circulating in your physical body, and feeling outward into the sensations of being covered, being under the dome of protection, feeling the band or the arms of being in the territory as the property of God. And if you have desires or what we label as prayers inside of you, then like Queen Esther, invite yourselves in the utterance of those words. If I have found favor with you, if it pleases you, if it is your will, if it pleases the King, if I am regarded with favor, if you think it is the right thing to do, then fast forwarding to the New Testament, be it done unto me according to your will. So take a deep breath in and then exhale. And we are complete.